The keypad on room 214 beeped twice and the door swung open. I stepped in with my duffel over one shoulder and stopped. Dara Ose was sitting cross-legged on the left side of a king bed, laptop open, her trail runners already placed neatly near the baseboard heater. She looked up at me, with the exact expression she wore in project reviews when she had already seen the flaw in my argument and was waiting patiently for me to catch up. "The storm took out the east wing," she said, "fluting in the basement. Front desk called me about 20 minutes ago. I left you the right side." She said it the same way she said everything at work. Finished, considered, not asking for input. My eyes went to her nightstand before I could stop them. A small brass drafting compass sat near her water glass, folded flat. The kind that architects carry, the kind that surveyors carried before that. I recognized it immediately, not because it was hers, but because it looked exactly like mine. I said, "Right side's fine." "My name is Nolan Cresswell. I'm 37 years old, and I've worked as a senior urban planner at Northfield Plus Associates for 9 years, 9 floors up in a glass building on Davie Street in Vancouver's Yaletown, where the windows face False Creek and you can watch the seaplanes land if a meeting runs long enough. I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Mount Pleasant that still has my ex-wife's bookshelves, because I haven't gotten around to replacing them. Catherine left 2 years ago, not loudly, not unkindly. She said I was more present in buildings I hadn't designed yet than in any room she was actually in. She wasn't wrong. We signed the papers on a February afternoon, and I drove home, across the Cambie Bridge feeling, for the first time in years, like the windows were clean. The brass compass in my jacket pocket had belonged to my father. He was a land surveyor out of Prince George for 35 years, gone the January I turned 30. The compass folds into a shape no bigger than a folded bill, and it lives in the interior pocket of whatever jacket I wear, against my left ribs. He carried it the same way. He said a man should always know which direction he's facing. I used to think that was about navigation. I understand now that it wasn't. My closest friend at the office is Oscar Tran, a visualization specialist with a laugh that carries through 2 closed doors and a habit of narrating other people's professional lives as if he's commentating a curling match. He is the only person in the building who can make me laugh in the middle of a budget review. And then there is Dara Ose, 32 years old, senior landscape architect. She joined Northfield 3 years ago from a firm in Toronto, where she had spent 4 years building a reputation for being the person in the room who asked the question nobody else was willing to ask. At Northfield, she had spent those same 3 years asking those questions directly at me, across a boardroom table, in front of 14 colleagues, who had started placing informal bets on which of us would eventually say something we couldn't take back. Oscar called us the weather system. He meant it affectionately, I think. The firm retreat was 4 days in Tofino, mandatory attendance, a lodge overlooking Chesterman Beach, November. For anyone who hasn't been to Tofino in November, the Pacific is gray and enormous, and the storms come in sideways and the whole town smells of wood smoke and salt and wet cedar. It's the kind of place that takes the word mandatory out of a work trip and makes it feel like something else entirely. What I had not counted on was that the BC Landscape Architecture Society was holding a regional summit at the same lodge that same weekend. Dara had known. She'd mentioned it to Oscar 2 weeks before. I found out from Oscar while we were loading gear into the van in the Northfield parking lot at 7 in the morning. "Dara's people are at the same lodge," he said, handing me a coffee from the drive-thru we'd stopped at on Granville. "Full overlap. Should be a very peaceful 4 days." I told him I wasn't worried. It wasn't entirely true. The drive to Horseshoe Bay took 40 minutes. We caught the 9:30 ferry to Nanaimo, 2.5 hours across the Strait of Georgia. I stood on the upper deck for most of the crossing with my collar up against the wind. I caught myself glancing through the porthole window back into the passenger lounge 3 times to see whether Dara was reading or sleeping. She was reading. Oscar appeared beside me with a bag of chips and the look he wore when he was about to say something he'd been rehearsing. "Cresswell, if you and Osi end up in the same workshop group this weekend, I'm starting a side business." I told him that wasn't going to happen. He tilted his bag of chips toward me in a way that said he disagreed. The lodge was everything the website had promised: dark timber, stone fireplace in the lobby, rain hammering the tall windows, the kind of place where the furniture is too heavy to ever move and that feels like a deliberate choice. The desk was staffed by a young woman named Jonna. She frowned at her screen for a long moment, and then looked up. "Mr. Cresswell, I'm so sorry. There's been a significant issue with the East Wing. We had some flooding come through the basement this afternoon, and we've had to pull 4 rooms. The only room we have available is a king suite already registered to a Ms. Osei. I can try to reach her if—" She was already picking up the phone. I heard her say, "Yes, ma'am. Okay, thank you." She set it down and printed me a key card. She said to go right up. I took the elevator to the 2nd floor. I told myself that 4 days was not a long time. I told myself we were adults. I set my jaw and tapped the key card to room 214 and pushed the door open and found her sitting there with the compass on her nightstand. After the door closed behind me, we managed the first 3 hours in a series of quiet, reasonable agreements that surprised me. She didn't look up when I set my bag on the right side of the dresser. I didn't comment when she moved her laptop charger to make room. I offered to sleep on the sofa. She waved it off without turning her head. "Cresswell, we've survived 3 years of the seawall corridor project. The bed is big enough." She said it like a woman who had considered the sentence in advance and was satisfied with how it landed. She had a headache, she mentioned, from the ferry crossing. I noticed the electric kettle on the small table by the window. I filled it without thinking and found a chamomile tea bag in the basket next to the mugs and set the cup on her nightstand, without saying anything about it. She went still for a moment, the way she sometimes went still in a meeting when something surprised her and she didn't want it to show. Then she said quietly, "Thank you, Nolan." Not Cresswell, Nolan. In 3 years she had never once used my first name. I didn't comment on it. I turned off my bedside lamp and reached into my jacket pocket for the compass, habit, the same way my father used to set it on the nightstand at motels when he traveled for work and brought me along as a kid, and placed it next to the alarm clock. She noticed immediately. "That's not a drafting tool," she said. "Not the way you carry it." I gave her the short version. My father, Prince George, 35 years with a transit level and a compass, gone when I turned 30. The habit of setting it near whatever lamp was closest when I slept away from home. She was quiet for a moment, only a moment. "He sounds like someone I would have liked to talk to about land," she said. And then she reached over and turned off her lamp, and the room went dark. I lay awake thinking that Dara Osei, in 3 years, had challenged every site analysis I had ever presented, and I had not known until that moment that she thought about land the way I thought about it. The first workshop the next morning was a joint session, Northfield people mixed with the landscape architects from the summit. Dara and I were assigned to the same table group. In 3 years, being in the same working group had always resulted in a disagreement by the time the markers came out. That morning she slid the scenario brief across the table to me and sat to my left and only spoke when she saw me missing something I was actually missing. When she did speak, her voice was lower than it was in the boardroom, the edge pulled back, and she pointed at the site map with one finger, the way someone points at something they find genuinely interesting. Oscar walked past our table, slowed to a stop, looked at us, looked away, kept walking. He texted me from 4 tables over, 0 arguments, and it's already 10 a.m. Is this real life? At lunch he found me at the buffet and stood beside me with a plate of food that made no structural sense. "Cresswell, 2 hours, nothing broken. What happened in there?" I said we were collaborating. He said, "Right, my parents called it that too before they realized they were in love." He laughed at his own joke. Dara was standing behind him with a coffee, and she laughed too quietly into her collar. Oscar heard her. To his credit, he kept his eyes on the salad tongs. The afternoon session was called Tension Points. The facilitator paired us and asked us each to describe a professional decision we still carried regret about. I went first and talked about a transit node redesign I had pushed through in my first year at Northfield, overriding a planner's community engagement timeline because I was convinced I was right. I wasn't. The redesign worked on paper and failed in the neighborhood. I still know the block it was on. Then Dara spoke. She described a moment 3 years before she came to Northfield, a project review at her previous firm in Toronto, where a junior associate she had been mentoring was presenting to the senior partners, and one of them dismantled her work in a way that had nothing to do with the work. Dara said she froze. Someone else in the room intervened. She never forgot it. She said she came to landscape architecture in the first place because she believed the built environment was the most honest record of what a society actually valued, and watching someone use it as a weapon against a person who had nothing left to learn had stayed with her longer than any project she'd ever finished. I asked her who had intervened. She changed the subject with such practiced ease that I only understood later that the pivot itself had been an answer. We had an hour before dinner. She asked if I wanted to walk on the beach. In 3 years, neither of us had ever suggested anything to the other that wasn't related to a site boundary or a zoning amendment. I said yes. We walked south along Chesterman in waterproof layers, the sand dark from rain, the surf loud enough that we had to speak at a normal volume instead of the careful indoor quiet we'd been using since the night before. After a few minutes she asked, "Why do you always let the junior planners run the room in client presentations?" I said, "Because someone once let me run the room when I was junior and had no business doing it. He didn't have to." She said, "Who?" I said, "My dad at a public consultation in Prince George when I was 22. She was quiet for a long time after that, the kind of quiet that the ocean fills so naturally that neither of you feels the need to add to it. We turned back after about 20 minutes without deciding to turn back. We walked the whole way home in the same easy silence. Dinner was at the Lodge restaurant, 8 of us wedged around a table meant for 6, cedar plank salmon and too many bread rolls, one of those meals that stretches itself out because nobody really wants to leave. When the server came around for drinks, Dara didn't open the menu. "Rye and ginger for him," she said, nodding toward me. "Canadian Club if you have it." I looked at her. She kept her eyes on the server. Oscar made a sound that was technically coughing. I said, "How do you know my drink?" She finally looked at me. "You've ordered it at every firm event for 3 years, Nolan." She held my gaze for exactly 1 beat and then went back to her menu. Back in the room, I was at the sink brushing my teeth when I saw it in the mirror. She had taken her compass out of her jacket and set it on the desk beside her laptop. Same size, same brass finish, same folding hinge. The clip on hers was angled just slightly differently. That was the only difference I could find. I kept my voice even. "Nice compass." "It helps me think," she said. "Where did you get it?" She hesitated. Half a second. The kind of pause that you feel before you hear it. "A shop," she said, "in Toronto a while ago." Her hand resting flat on the keyboard was completely still. "We sorted the bed the second night the same way we had sorted it the first. 2 reasonable people making a reasonable arrangement. Lights off, a foot of white duvet between us. On the nightstands, her water glass, my phone, the 2 compasses, hers resting on top of her field notebook, mine on the little coaster the lodge left for glasses." Sometime after midnight, when she thought I was asleep, she said very quietly into the dark, "I spent 3 years arguing with the most careful person in the room, Nolan. I don't know why I ever thought that was the same as not admiring them." I did not breathe for a long time after that. I lay in the dark listening to the storm work its way up the coast, watching the light from the water move in slow stripes across the ceiling, smelling the faint chamomile from the cup I had made her the night before. 2 brass compasses on 2 nightstands, both catching the same gray light from the same window, needles pointing the same direction. She had said my first name twice that day, once in the afternoon when I'd set the tea down on her side of the nightstand, and once in the dark when she thought no one was listening. Both times without the boardroom in her voice. Both times as if my name were a small object she had been holding carefully for a long time, and had finally in the dark allowed herself to set down. I lay there thinking that every argument we'd had in 3 years might have been about something neither of us was saying. I didn't know what. I only knew the compass on the nightstand was no longer the only one in the room, and that the woman who had bought its twin had not once told me where. The next morning the summit brought in external speakers, landscape architects and planners from across BC and Alberta, and after the morning session there was a mixer on the lodge's covered terrace, propane heaters, and November rain hammering the overhang, white wine and the kind of standing conversations that feel purposeful and aren't. I was held down in a long exchange with a developer from Kelowna about density bonusing when I noticed, over his shoulder, a woman I hadn't expected to see in Tofino. Her name was Helena. We had met at a planning symposium in Calgary 4 years ago, when I was still married to Catherine, and we had worked together briefly on a federal grant submission before I understood what kind of working relationship she preferred. It had not gone anywhere. But the 7 weeks of it had been enough for Catherine to ask me a question I hadn't answered honestly, and the gap between what she asked and what I said had lived in our marriage like a hairline crack in a wall until the February it stopped mattering. Helena was now a principal at a competing firm in North Vancouver. She had a room at the same lodge. I did not know until later what she had walked across the terrace to say. I pieced it together from Oscar, who had been standing near the heaters with a warm drink. Helena had crossed to the bar where Dara was standing alone for about 30 seconds between conversations. She had introduced herself with too much warmth and too fast a handshake. Then, according to Oscar, her voice had shifted into a lower register that he couldn't follow through the wind and the rain, but that made Dara's shoulders change, not tighten, change. The way a door closes, not slams. What Helena said, as Dara told me only much later, was this. She had told Dara that she and I were close, that I was the kind of man who kept things cleanly separated, work was work, personal was personal, and that anyone who waited for me to cross that line on my own would wait a very long time. She said it with the warmth of someone describing a friend's endearing flaw. She said she hoped Dara knew what she was signing up for, that I was worth it, but that not everyone had the patience. She was gone from the terrace before I got there. I found Dara in the room just before 6. She was standing at the window with her back to me, her field notebook closed on the desk. She didn't turn around. "I think I'll take the sofa tonight. I have some notes to catch up on." Her voice was flat the way good lumber is flat, no give, no grain showing. I asked her what had happened. She said nothing. She said it exactly the way I always said it to Oscar. She did not come down to dinner. I sat beside Oscar and worked through a plate of food that tasted like nothing and waited for him to tell me. He told me halfway through the main course quietly, without making it a thing. Helena was at the mixer. She talked to Dara. I saw it from 20 feet away. I don't know what she said, but it landed. I set my fork down. When I came upstairs, Dara was already on the sofa with her back to the room, blanket pulled to her shoulder. On the desk, my brass compass had been moved, pushed back toward my side of the surface, the way you return something you've been keeping that no longer belongs to you. Her own compass was zipped away somewhere, out of sight entirely. It was the clearest sentence anyone had ever written me, without a single word. The morning was our last full day. Oscar texted me from across the breakfast room. Dara was at a corner table alone with a piece of dry toast and black coffee she wasn't drinking. She critiqued the session materials she was supposed to co-develop with the precision she always brought to work. Sharp, correct, exact. But the light behind it was gone. She was running the mechanics without the engine. Oscar said nothing funny all morning. He just pressed his foot against mine under the table at one point and said, very quietly, "Go find her, Cresswell." I found Helena at the coffee bar first. She saw the compass in my jacket pocket. She'd seen it in Calgary 4 years ago, and she remembered. She smiled the way people smile when they've confirmed something to themselves. "Still carrying that thing," she said. "Always," I said. She held my eye for a second longer than a stranger would have, and then she walked away, and I understood exactly what had done and why. I understood that she had done it in the particular, measured way of someone who has decided that removing a possibility is the same as being careful. I found Dara on the covered deck at the back of the lodge in the late afternoon. The storm had eased to a low gray swell and the beach was empty. She was standing at the railing facing the water. I came and stood about 2 feet to her left and she didn't move away. I told her about Helena. The full version, the 7 weeks in Calgary, the grant submission, the moment I understood what she wanted and ended it. The conversation with Catherine that I had handled wrong, the small fracture that had lived in our marriage until it stopped mattering. I told her that Helena had never been anything more than a professional acquaintance, an uncomfortable few months, and a thing I had not handled as well as I should have. I told her that whatever Helena had said about me keeping things separated, about anyone who waited being in for a long haul, I needed her to know that was one reading of a person who had been too careful for too long and was, lately, trying to learn a different speed. The ocean was loud and patient. Dara looked at the water for a while. Then she reached into her jacket and took out her brass compass and held it in both hands, turning it once. "I was watching a live stream of a regional planning symposium in Vancouver," she said, 3 years before I came to Northfield. Still at my firm in Toronto, side room, bad connection, big screen. One of the breakout panels was on public space and belonging. A planner from a mid-size Yaletown firm went off script during the Q&A to step in for a junior associate who was getting taken apart by a panelist. Calm, no theatrics. He just turned the entire conversation around until she could breathe again. She looked at me. I saw the compass in his jacket pocket when he stood up. It caught the room light. She held hers up. I ordered mine from the same maker 2 days later. I have never used it for drafting. I just carry it. I did not say anything for a long time. She kept going. She told me she had applied to Northfield 8 months after that symposium, telling herself it was because the firm's transit corridor work was exactly where she wanted to be. She told me she had assumed I was still married because she had been too careful to look. By the time she'd been at Northfield 6 months and understood that I wasn't, the armor was on. The professional adversary persona was fully built. It let her sit across a boardroom table from me 4 times a week and never have to ask a single question she wasn't ready to be turned down for. Every time I challenged your analysis, she said, I was buying myself another Tuesday in that room. She set her compass down on the railing between us. The last of the late afternoon light caught it the way light catches old brass. I reached forward and picked it up, turned it once, set it down beside mine, both needles pointing north. In my head, I was going back through 3 years. Every time she had redirected the entire table to a flaw I'd missed and been right about it. Every time she had taken the chair to my left in a briefing so we were looking at the same screen instead of each other. Every time she had known my order before I gave it. 3 years, and I had read it as competition. My father used to say that the land doesn't argue with itself. 2 landforms can push against each other for 1,000 years, and what they make between them is a mountain range. He meant it about geology. I have come to believe he meant it about something else. I did not touch her that evening. We stood at the railing until the light was gone and then walked back inside together. Inside the room, I unfolded the blanket from the closet and made up the sofa. She got into the bed. Neither of us said good night. Neither of us needed to. I lay awake longer than I slept, thinking about 3 years of meetings where I had believed I was being sharpened by opposition. I had not been. I had been kept attentive, all that time, by a woman who was afraid of what would happen if she stopped. We drove back to Nanaimo the next morning and caught the noon ferry. We didn't sit together inside, but we stood at the same railing on the upper deck for most of the crossing, watching the mainland come into view. She didn't say much. I said less. At one point, a wave sent a fine spray up over the rail, and she stepped back and half turned toward me with the same expression she'd worn the first night when I'd set the tea down. The one I had been trying to read for 3 years without the right vocabulary. When we got back to Vancouver, we didn't explain anything to anyone. We simply stopped pretending. The Monday after the retreat, at 7:20 in the morning, I walked into the coffee shop on the corner of Davie and Mainland that I had walked past for 9 years without once going into. Dara was already at the corner table with 2 cups. There was no rye and ginger on the menu, so she'd ordered me an Americano with the same 2 sugars I put in my coffee at the office and had apparently noticed enough times to remember exactly. We didn't speak for 11 minutes. I know because I looked at my phone once and then put it face down on the table. It was the most useful 11 minutes I had spent in years. Oscar walked in around minute 12, saw us at that corner table, stopped with one hand still on the door, then turned around and walked back out to the sidewalk. He texted me one word, finally. We built our routine slowly. Nothing announced. The evening before any significant project presentation she was leading, I would leave my brass compass on her keyboard before I went home. Folded, oriented north, a small exactness that was entirely unnecessary. She would never use it. She would keep it on the desk beside her during the work, and it would be back on my keyboard by the time I came in the next morning, pointing north again. Neither of us ever spoke about it. Oscar noticed by week 2 and had the particular grace never to say a word. 6 weeks after Tofino, Helena sent me an email, subject line, "Good to see you in November." 1 line of text. Coffee would be nice. I read it at my desk at 7 in the morning and dragged it into a folder called Archive, which was otherwise empty, and I left it there without answering. I didn't delete it. It felt important to have made the choice, rather than to have pretended the choice wasn't there. 3 months in, Dara was approached by a firm in Calgary, a principal-level position, significant equity stake. The kind of offer that goes to your financial advisor before you decide either way. She turned it down in under 48 hours. I found out from Oscar at the espresso machine on a Thursday. She turned down a partnership track in Calgary. Have you actually talked to her, Cresswell? Like about what this is? I said we talked every day. Oscar said, I mean a conversation where you say the actual thing. I asked her that night at her apartment in Commercial Drive, standing in her kitchen while she made pasta, and I was nominally helping but was mostly in the way. She didn't turn around from the stove. It wasn't the right time to leave Vancouver, she said. Why not? She was quiet long enough that I stepped toward her. I put my hand on her shoulder blade gently and felt her exhale shift under my palm. She kept stirring. Because not everything here is finished yet, she said. She didn't lean back into my hand by more than a centimeter. It was enough. 8 months after Tofino, the entire Northfield team returned to the same lodge for the same annual retreat. Jana was still at the front desk. She recognized us and looked from one of us to the other, and then opened her mouth and then closed it and printed one keycard and held it out toward Dara. Room 214. We dropped our bags and walked straight out to the covered deck at the back of the lodge. She reached into her jacket. I reached into mine. She set her compass on the railing. I set mine beside it. For the record, she said, this is where I'm going to remember the first time. 7 months of patience, neither of us in a hurry. On the same deck at almost the same hour of dusk the following November, I asked her to marry me. Not on one knee, she would have been embarrassed for both of us. I took a small box from my jacket pocket and set it on the railing next to the 2 compasses and let her open it herself. She laughed once, a real laugh, and then picked up my compass and turned it in the light and said, South-southwest. Very deliberate, Cresswell. She handed it back and signed the dinner receipt that night with her field pen, because I had left mine in the room, and she held it out to me and said simply, use this. It was a joke that only the 2 of us would ever fully understand, and it kept being funny for the rest of our lives. The wedding was in the backyard of my mother's house in North Vancouver on a Saturday in June. 28 people, strings of lights through the cedar trees, the smell of grass and the inlet just beyond the fence. Oscar's toast ran 3 minutes long and ended in what he insisted were allergies. The junior associate from the planning symposium, the one whose work had been taken apart on screen that afternoon, the reason Dara had ever watched a panel from a side room in Toronto. She flew in from Halifax for the weekend. Dara had invited her privately, months before. She sat in the second row. I watched her reach into her jacket pocket during the ceremony and press her hand against something small inside it. She didn't show me until the kitchen afterward. A small brass compass of her own, bought the year after the symposium. Her name was Amara. She was a landscape architect in Halifax now, running her own studio. She had bought the compass, she said, because of the man on the panel who'd pointed at a slide and turned the whole room around. I wore my father's compass in my jacket pocket all day. Dara's was sewn into the lining of her dress by a seamstress she'd found in Gastown, at Dara's very specific and non-negotiable request. We signed the marriage certificate with 2 ordinary pens. The compasses were what mattered. 2 years after Tofino, we were promoted together and began running the planning and landscape division from a shared office on the 8th floor, the windows facing the water. Helena's firm had been absorbed by a national group by then. I knew from a mutual colleague that she had relocated to Montreal. I didn't look any further. On the shared desk at the far end of our office, 2 brass compasses lived together in a small ceramic dish that Dara brought back from a site visit in the Okanagan. Visitors assume their equipment. We don't correct them. There is one more detail I want to get right. Amara flies to Vancouver every year around the time the Cannes Lion results come out. Her tradition, not ours. She always has lunch with the 2 of us, and she always asks Dara the same question at the end. Do you remember what you said to me after that panel? Dara always says she doesn't remember. Amara always laughs. Neither do I just remember that someone didn't leave the room. I'm writing this from our desk on the 8th floor on a Tuesday evening in October. Dara left an hour ago. The building is quiet. The False Creek lights are coming on outside the window. In the ceramic dish in front of me sit 2 brass compasses, both needles pointing north. I picked mine up a moment ago, turned it once, put it back down. My father used to say the most important thing a compass does is tell you where you are, not where you're going. That you can navigate a whole life from a single fixed point as long as you choose the right one. For 3 years I thought Dara Osi was my opposition. For 3 years she thought she was just staying in the room. We were both wrong, and we were both lucky that wrong lasted long enough for a November storm to flood the East Wing at exactly the right moment. There is a kind of love that announces itself early, loud, certain, impossible to miss. And there is a kind of love that shows up to every meeting, challenges every assumption you've grown comfortable with, knows your order before you give it, and says into the dark of a hotel room, when it thinks you're already asleep, the thing it has been holding for years without a reason to set down. She had not been arguing with me. She had only ever been making sure I stayed in the room. So before you go, I want to ask you 2 things. Has there been anyone in your life who pushed back on everything you did? Not because they were against you, but because that was the closest they knew how to get. And if you had been standing at the door of room 214, with a keycard in your hand, and found the person you'd thought was your rival sitting on the other side of the bed, looking up at you with that particular kind of patience, would you have walked in? If Nolan and Dara's story stayed with you, leave a like so I know you were here at the end. Subscribe to his private stories for more slow burn stories every week. And in the comments, tell me about a moment when someone showed up for you in exactly the wrong way, for exactly the right reasons.